By the late 1990s, Aiken County sat in that strange posture a lot of southern counties do, where history and modern life seemed to clash. The old wasn't out, but the new sure was in. Aiken County stretches along the western border of South Carolina, pressed up against Georgia with the Savannah River running between them, close enough that life in Aiken and North Augusta, South Carolina, and Augusta, long before it came associated with sprawling subdivisions, shopping centers, interstate exits, and the pull of nearby industry, the land had been shaped by farmers who arrived in the 1730s, immigrant families trying to make a life out of hard soil and harder work. It had once been part of the old Orangeburg and Edgefield districts. There had also been a significant population of indentured servants from Lincolnshire, England, and by the 1750s, many of those servants had served out their time, gained their freedom, and become landowners and farmers themselves. The county and its seat were later named for William Aiken, the first president of the South Carolina Railroad Company, and in 1871, its original boundaries were drawn by a commission led by Prince Rivers, a freed slave and state legislator. For generations, Aiken County's economy leaned on agriculture, and then, on the rails and over time, it picked up a new hobby. It became horse country, the kind of place known for horse breeding, racehorses, steeplechase races, and old traditions that are still celebrated today. Whitney Field, still in Aiken today, is the oldest polo field in the United States. The county was rich with history, and we're only hitting the tip of the iceberg. By the end of the 20th century, though, the county was no museum piece. It had changed with the times, even if it still held tight to its old self-image. The economy now moved largely through the Savannah River site, the place locals often referred to bluntly as the bomb plant, along with Firestone manufacturers, insurers, medical companies, and hospitals. It had produced its share of recognizable names too, people who made it far past that county line. There was Richland County Sheriff Leon Lott. There were football stars William the Refrigerator Perry and Michael Dean Perry. There was Janie Mines. There was wrestler Paul White, better known to most people as The Big Show. To a lot of outsiders, that was the version of Aiken County they might understand, if they knew it at all. A place of horses, military spillover, industry, local pride, and to be frank, Southern wealth. Which is exactly why what happened there, and just across the river in Augusta, feels so jarring looking back. Because when people remember serial predators, they tend to imagine places like Atlanta or New York City. They don't think of the county with the oldest polo field in history or the home of the Masters tournament. And yet, that is where this story takes place. To uncover the secrets of one of Augusta's most infamous serial killers, we need to go behind the headlines. In May of 1998, in Augusta, Georgia, a college student named Jen Durbin was doing something that should have been exciting, something nearly everyone does at some point in their life. It was Saturday, and she was shopping for items for her first apartment. She was waiting tables while going to school, working for what she had, building toward a life that felt like it was just beginning to turn into one she wanted to live. When she got out of the car at that shopping center, she heard a man calling out to her. She turned and saw a man sitting in a white van. She later described him as possibly in his early 30s, clean-cut, Hispanic-looking, with an olive complexion, dark hair, and dark eyes. He did not strike her right away as someone obviously menacing. In fact, she said he kind of looked like a young dad. He asked her for directions to Washington Road, the main thoroughfare in Augusta, and the surrounding areas, and she directed him. Then, instead of moving on, he kept talking. He asked about nightclubs and where he could go for drinks, and because she was a college student at the time and local, it all still seemed within the boundaries of an annoying but manageable interaction, so she answered him. And then the conversation took an odd turn because he told her he was a modeling scout. He asked if she had ever modeled before. Jen told him that when she was younger, she had done a little modeling, and that was all the opening he needed. He told her she was striking. He asked if she would come with him so he could take some pictures. That was the moment the whole vibe changed. Jen immediately understood it for what it was, or at least what it probably was. One of the basic rules of modeling, she would later explain, is that agencies contract you directly. Strangers don't roll up on you in a parking lot and try to recruit you off the street. So she ended the conversation and tried to leave, but as she started walking toward the store, he kept inching the van closer to her, still calling out, still trying to draw her back into the conversation. Jen ignored him, went inside, and once she was safely in the store, she settled on the explanation that many people give about men like him. He's just a creep, a pervert, a weird little man in a parking lot. Disturbing, yes, dangerous, maybe, but not someone she would call the police about, not someone she imagined would be part of a far larger problem. In the months after Jen's encounter, the same type of incident kept happening across Aiken, North Augusta, and the broader Augusta area. Women described a Hispanic-looking man in a white minivan approaching them. Police got complaint after complaint. The host described these incidents with a phrase that says a lot about how they were viewed at the time. They were called pervert calls. That name alone tells you something about the gap between what was happening and what people understood was happening. A nuisance, a creep, a pest, someone alarming but maybe not someone officers recognized as an escalating threat. If things had been handled a little differently from the get-go, maybe we wouldn't even be discussing this case. But hindsight is merciless that way. At the time, it was still possible to wave him off as a strange man, someone who got his kicks from bothering women in public. A few months after Jen's run-in, 19-year-old Kathy Krantz found herself in a version of the same encounter. Kathy was walking to work not far from her home when a man in a white van approached her and asked for directions. Like Jen, she tried to help him, and like Jen, she realized quickly that he had no real intention of just taking the directions and leaving. He kept talking. He asked whether she had ever modeled, and Kathy told him yes when she was younger. He then asked if she would be interested in posing for nude photographs. Kathy said no. She told him she was on her way back to work, but he didn't stop there. He escalated again, just like he had with Jen, only this time in a slightly different direction. He told Kathy he partly owned an escort service and said he could use nude photographs to market her to potential clients and that she could make good money doing it. He was not being subtle. He was suggesting that she enter sex work right there on the side of the road in broad daylight. He had guts, which would most certainly prove to be a problem. Kathy told him she was not interested and kept trying to get to work, but the exchange dragged on for around 20 minutes. Later, she would describe him as engaging, nice-looking, wearing reflective sunglasses that made it impossible to see his eyes, and he had dark, slick-back hair and olive skin. The conversation grew more vulgar as it went on. He began asking about her sexual preferences, asking whether she liked to be on top or on bottom. Kathy was absolutely appalled and disgusted, just as any normal person would be, so she just stopped answering him and began to walk away. He called after her and offered her a ride because it was hot outside, but still, she ignored him and kept going. He stayed parked nearby at a church and watched her walk all the way to work. And just like Jen, Kathy came away from that encounter with a version of the same conclusion. He was some weird pervert, creepy, yes, gross, absolutely, but not necessarily someone she thought to report. Not because she was careless, but because women deal with men like this constantly, and as mentioned before, they were just called pervert calls. Nothing was really done about them. Jen and Kathy were the lucky ones. They got away. Melissa Dingess did not. On Saturday, July 17, 1999, 17-year-old Melissa disappeared in Aiken County. Melissa was a newlywed. She was off work that day, but her husband had to work, and the two of them had only one car, so he took it. Melissa got bored at home alone and decided to walk about 600 yards from the house to a payphone. She called her mother and asked if she could come pick her up so they could spend the day together. Her mother could not pick her up. Her own car had broken down the day before, so Melissa stayed where she was. At 3 o'clock that afternoon, her husband came home from work and found the house empty. At first, he assumed maybe her mother had found a ride or a friend had stopped by and picked her up. Then he noticed the money he had left for Melissa was still on the table. Her shoes were still there, so were her purse and wallet. They were the sort of ordinary items that immediately told him something was wrong, because they were things she would normally have taken if she had chosen to leave on her own. He called the police right away and reported her missing. As often happens in cases involving a missing spouse, investigators first focused on the husband. They checked his whereabouts, his timeline, his story, but his alibi was airtight. He had been at work all day. Time records confirmed it. Witnesses confirmed it, so the search for Melissa began in earnest. Media coverage went out around the area. Friends and neighbors near the couple's mobile home were interviewed. People were asked what they had seen, who had been nearby, and whether anyone unusual had been in the area, but no one saw anything. No one could explain where she had gone. There was no sign of a struggle that solved the mystery, no eyewitness that stepped forward with a missing piece, no trail that police could follow. Days turned into weeks, weeks turned into months. Melissa remained missing, and the case seemed to stall almost as soon as it began. No suspect, no real clue, just a 17-year-old newlywed who had walked to a payphone and vanished. Then came December 4th, 1999. another Saturday, and another 17-year-old wife. Tiffany Wilson and her husband Josh were getting their 2-month-old daughter Caitlin ready for Santa pictures at a local shopping center in Jackson, South Carolina. Josh had originally planned to go with them, but he had worked the night before and was exhausted, so the couple made a practical decision. Tiffany would take the baby, Josh would stay home and sleep. Tiffany and Caitlin left around midday. At about 3 that afternoon, Tiffany called home and told Josh she was stopping at the Winn-Dixie for groceries before heading back. He said, "Okay," and went back to sleep. That decision, forgettable in the moment and simple, became one of those tiny interactions people revisit forever. The last speck of normalcy before everything fell apart. Josh woke up around 10 that night and found the house empty. Tiffany and Caitlin were both still gone. He called Tiffany's mother, but she did not know where they were. At first, Josh wondered if Tiffany might just be with friends, but the longer the night went on, the less that explanation held. He and Tiffany's mother both started to worry. Her mother began retracing the likely route Tiffany would have taken, thinking maybe there had been car trouble somewhere along the way. Josh went straight to the grocery store because it was the last place he knew for certain that she had planned to be. There, at the Winn-Dixie, he found Tiffany's car. He called Tiffany's mother, and she came to meet him. Using a spare key, Josh opened the vehicle. He hoped for some simple and reasonable explanation, maybe some mechanical issue that had forced her to leave it behind. But when he turned the key, the car started up right away. No dead battery, no obvious breakdowns, nothing explained why Tiffany and the baby were gone. So he and Tiffany's mother split up and started checking with friends. House after house, stop after stop, the answer was the same. No one had seen her. At 5 o'clock on the morning of Sunday, December 5th, they reported Tiffany and Caitlin missing to Aiken County Sheriff's Department. And while investigators were still taking down the information for that missing persons report, another call came in. A baby had been found abandoned in a baby carrier at the Georgia Welcome Center on Interstate 20. The baby was identified as 2-month-old Caitlin Wilson. She was safe, unharmed, and alive. It was the kind of development that should have brought relief, and it did, but only part of it. Josh later made clear that he was thankful his daughter was safe, but he wanted to know where his wife was, because Caitlin had been left across state lines in Georgia while the rest of the investigation centered in South Carolina. Caitlin had been left across state lines in Georgia while the rest of the investigation centered in South Carolina. The FBI came in, as they often do in multi-state situations, but instead of immediately unlocking the case, that expanded attention seemed to harden suspicion around the most familiar target. Investigators focused intensely on Josh Wilson. From their perspective, he had not gone with his wife and daughter. He had stayed home alone. No one could verify exactly where he was or what he was doing while he was there. He later said detectives interrogated him aggressively and told him to tell them where Tiffany was, or he would get the needle. He agreed to take a polygraph and allegedly failed it really badly. Then they leaned in on him even more, telling him that maybe if he just admitted what happened, maybe if he just told them where Tiffany was, they could work with him. Josh insisted he had done nothing. He told them to stop wasting their time on him and go find his wife. At one point, maddened by the pressure, he said that if they kept pushing him and insisting he was guilty without actually locating his wife, he would give them a reason to arrest him. And then, only a few hours into the investigation, detectives got called to a nearby mechanic shop. In a dumpster, there, someone had been found. Bloody, torn women's clothing. The clothing belonged to Tiffany Wilson. After that, the worst theories spread fast through the community, and a lot of people began to assume the police must be right about Josh. But they weren't. On Tuesday, December 28, 1999, just after Christmas, 2 hunters were in the woods off Kyle Road in Graniteville, South Carolina, when they found the nude body of a young woman. The Aiken County Sheriff's Department responded, and the body was identified as Tiffany. She had been stabbed, strangled, and raped. Her hands were bound behind her back. A used condom was found near her body. She would have turned 18 only days before she was found. Evidence from that crime scene cleared Josh Wilson and proved he had not been involved. Investigators had locked in on the wrong man, developed tunnel vision, and lost precious time doing so. Less than 6 months later, in June of 2000, Jen Durbin came face to face with the same man again. She was going to a friend's house when she heard someone calling out to her. She turned, and there he was, the same man in the same van who had approached her back in the shopping center the year before. This time, there was no uncertainty. She recognized him immediately, and unbelievably, he started the same way he always seemed to have started, asking for directions as if the script had never failed him. But Jen remembered. She told him he had already tried this with her once. She made it clear she was not giving him directions, and she was not going anywhere with him for modeling pictures. He laughed it off, as if she had made a joke, and then he drove away. Looking back, Jen said she had heard the media coverage by then about missing and murdered women around Aiken and Augusta, including Melissa Dingess and Tiffany Wilson, but she still had not fully connected the dots. Then, on June 29, 2000, another 17-year-old disappeared. Tabitha Bosdell left home for work at a call center and never made it there. Tabitha and her sister had grown up in foster care, and Tabitha was trying to build a better life for herself. A few years earlier, she had run away from home, and because that history existed on paper, authorities did not initially approach her disappearance with the same seriousness it demanded. Foster children are so often treated as though their absence is less urgent, less alarming, more explainable. Tabitha was never heard from again. She became yet another missing 17-year-old from Aiken County, and then Labor Day weekend came to an end. On Monday, September 4th, 2000, 21-year-old U.S. Army Sergeant Marni Glista went grocery shopping. Marni was married to another soldier who was deployed in Kuwait. They were stationed at Fort Gordon, currently named Fort Eisenhower, southwest of Augusta. She was described as smart, tough, and deeply committed to her duty. This was not someone who drifted casually through responsibilities. This was someone people counted on to show up. So when September 5th came and Marni failed to report for her duty or PT formation, her superiors knew immediately that something was wrong. They called her, no answer. Her husband in Kuwait grew concerned too when she missed their scheduled call time. So her superiors went to her home to check on her. The door was ajar. Her vehicle was still loaded with groceries. It was early in the morning on September 5th when the Richmond County Sheriff's Department was called for a welfare check. Officers arrived, saw no sign of forced entry, and went inside calling out for her. They found Marni on the bedroom floor. She was wearing only a bra. Her hands were bound behind her back. She had been visibly strangled, raped, and sodomized. And as the officers moved closer, they heard something they had not expected to hear at all: faint breathing. Marni Glista was still alive. She had been found on her bedroom floor with her hands bound behind her back, wearing only a bra, visibly strangled, raped, and sodomized, and yet she was still fighting for her life. EMS was called and she was rushed to the hospital, but survival in the most technical sense was not the same thing as recovery. Because of the asphyxiation, the damage was catastrophic. She was, for all practical purposes, brain dead. The violence had not just been brutal, it had been prolonged and deliberate enough to rob her of any real chance of coming back. At the house, investigators tried to build something out of what had been left behind, but the scene gave them almost nothing. They were unable to recover fingerprints or DNA. There was no sign of forced entry. A locked door kicked open is one kind of mystery. A door opened willingly, or at least without obvious resistance, is another. It pushed investigators toward the possibility that Marni may have known the person who came inside, or at a minimum, that he had found a way to make himself seem non-threatening long enough to get close. Neighbors were questioned, fellow soldiers were questioned, people who knew her routine, people who may have seen something, people who might recognize a name or a vehicle, or even just a strange interaction from the days before. But no meaningful leads emerged. There was no obvious connection tying Marni to the earlier disappearances and killings that had already rattled the Aiken-Augusta corridor. There was only another young woman, another life caving in under the weight of a violence no one yet seemed to be able to trace back to its source. 4 days later, on September 9th, 2000, Marni's family made the decision no family is ever ready to make. She was removed from life support. Hours later, she died. And just like that, the case moved from a desperate assault investigation into another murder with no useful leads. That was becoming the modus operandi, uncertainty, and that was part of what made the whole thing so terrifying. A woman disappeared or was attacked. Police scrambled, husbands and loved ones were scrutinized, communities filled the silence with rumor and fear. Then the trail went cold again. Melissa Dingess had vanished. Tiffany Wilson had been found raped and murdered. Tabitha Bosdell was gone. Marni Glista had now died from an assault so violent it suggested rage as much as it did compulsion. Yet even with all that, investigators still did not have a suspect they could actually pin anything on. They had no clean forensic path. No witness could identify the man, no evidence sturdy enough to stop him before he found someone else. Cases like this don't just wound families. They poison the air around a place. They teach women to rethink every errand, every walk to work, every stop at the store, every moment in a parking lot. And by early October 2000, that predator was still out there, still moving through the area, still finding ways to make himself look harmless until the exact moment he wasn't. Then on October 10th, 2000, the break finally came, though it came at a terrible cost. A 911 dispatcher received a frantic call from a young woman whose voice was raspy and damaged. She said she had been raped and stabbed. Richmond County deputies and EMS raced to the location in Augusta, and when they got there, they found 18-year-old Chrisilee Barton collapsed on the living room floor. She was wearing only a bra. She was covered in blood. She had multiple stab wounds, including one on her throat. It was immediately clear that she was gravely injured, but it was just as clear that she was still conscious and still able to talk. Investigators understood in that instant how critical it was to get her statement while they still could. They had already seen what happened with Marni Glista. They had seen a living victim become a homicide victim before they were ever really able to hear from her. Detective Richard Roundtree, who would later become sheriff of Richmond County, rode in the ambulance with Chrisilee on the way to the hospital because he didn't want to lose the chance to hear from her if she died before they arrived. It was a grim decision, but it was also the right one. The case had reached a point where every second mattered. Chrisilee, wounded and fighting to hold herself together, gave them the beginning of the answer they had been missing. She said she had been waiting for her boss at Huddle House in North Augusta, South Carolina, when a Hispanic-looking man in a teal Honda approached her. Not a white van this time, but still the same basic approach. The same type of man, the same unsettling blend of casual conversation and creeping preposition. Chrisilee described his complexion, his hair, his eyes, and noted that the car stood out because of its unusual teal hue. He told her he was a modeling scout and also said he owned an escort service. It was the same script, only now it had been more polished in its brazenness. He offered her $200 to pose for some pictures. He told her he would follow her to her home and take the photographs there where it would be private and on her own turf. Her boss hadn't shown up, and she began to think that maybe she had gotten stood up or just got the time wrong. She asked the man for identification, some kind of card, some proof that he actually was with an agency. He couldn't provide any, and that should have been the end of it. On some level, she knew that. She was reluctant, but she was also looking for work, and predators bank on that space between doubt and need. Eventually, she agreed, and he followed her home. On the drive back, Chrisilee's instincts kept pressing at her. She changed her mind, realized she had made a mistake, so she began driving faster, trying to lose him, trying to shake him off before she ever pulled into her driveway. But she couldn't. He kept up with her. No matter what she did, where she went, he stayed on her tail. Eventually, she gave in and went home. Once inside, he asked if he could use her phone to call his boss and let him know what he was doing. It was a simple request, ordinary on the surface, the kind of final gesture meant to keep her from bolting before he could trap her. She said yes and went to the bathroom to freshen up, but instead of using the phone, he went into the kitchen and armed himself. When Chrisilee came out of the bathroom, he jumped her immediately and started stabbing her. He stabbed her several times, then he choked her until she was nearly unconscious. Once she was incapacitated, he stripped and raped her. Then he left her there, bleeding and badly wounded, assuming he had done enough. But Chrisilee did not die. She stayed alive long enough to gather herself and cling to the smallest possible chance of survival. About 5 minutes after he left, he came back. He wasn't simply fleeing, he was checking. He was returning to make sure the job was done. When he came back, he stabbed her 2 more times, including once in the throat, near her jugular. That wound explained why, when she called 911, her voice came out ragged and broken. He had come back to end her, and even that had not worked. Chrisilee underwent 6 hours of medical treatment and survived. Later, investigators would describe her as one of the toughest victims they had ever seen, and from everything that happened afterward, it was easy to understand why. She had been attacked with overwhelming violence, left for dead, attacked again, and still fought hard enough to stay alive and help identify the man who did it. Her determination did what months of dead ends had failed to do. At Chrisilee's house, investigators found confirmation almost immediately. A neighbor told them he had seen Chrisilee arrive home with a man following her in a strange teal-colored car with a paper tag. He saw the man get there, leave for about 5 minutes, then return briefly and leave again. That matched Chrisilee's account exactly. It also reinforced the chilling possibility that the attacker had gone back inside to make sure she was dead, just as he had likely done in earlier crimes in one form or another. Now the police had a living victim statement, an eyewitness who could place the suspect and his car at the house, and a vehicle description. A sketch artist came to the hospital, and based on Chrisilee's description, a composite sketch was produced. Investigators later said the sketch was extremely accurate. Sketches can so often be broad or tentative, a general likeness rather than a face people instantly know. This one, apparently, was not like that. The sketch and the description of the teal car were circulated across law enforcement agencies and sent to local media outlets in Augusta and Aiken. And then the floodgates opened. Within minutes of the composite being made public, a woman called in and said she knew exactly who that man in the sketch was. She identified him as her brother-in-law, Reinaldo Rivera. Then more calls started coming in, one after another, from people who knew him from different parts of his life. Church members, neighbors, other acquaintances, they all pointed to the same man, Reinaldo Rivera. Even his own sister-in-law reportedly said he had always given her a creepy vibe. Suddenly, after all this time, the faceless predator who had been hunting women across Aiken, North Augusta, and Augusta, was no longer faceless at all. He had a name, a family, a house, a job, a public life. And what the police found when they started digging into that life only made the whole thing more unsettling. Rivera was 37 years old. He was a husband and a father of 2. He was active in his church and his community. He was the son of a physician. He had been born in Madrid, Spain. And when he was 9, his family moved to Puerto Rico, where he attended school. Because Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, he was later able to enlist in the U.S. Navy. In 1986, he landed a job at the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., working for the Joint Chiefs of Staff. After retiring from the Navy in 1988, he settled into civilian work as a tire inspector at Firestone Tire and Rubber Company in Aiken. In 1993, he married his wife Tammy. Later, he would admit to raping women while he was in the military, which suggested this violence had not suddenly appeared in South Carolina, but had been traveling with him for years. Once police knew who they were dealing with, they moved fast. They rushed to Rivera's home in Graniteville, South Carolina. Inside, they found a cryptic note that resembled a suicide note, though it did not say so in plain terms. Rivera himself was not there. Investigators now knew they had identified a man capable of rape, murder, and attempted murder. They also knew he almost certainly knew they were looking for him. On October 11th, police released Rivera's name and photograph to the public. By then, the whole area was on alert. People were watching roads, parking lots, hotels, and gas stations. The next day, October 12th, a patrol officer spotted the teal car at the Rainbow Terrace Motel in Clearwater, South Carolina. He called for backup. Officers showed Rivera's photo to the desk clerk, and she confirmed that the man in the picture was staying in room 206. Police went straight there. When they entered the room, they found Rivera sprawled across the bed. His wrists were slit. A suicide note was nearby. But just like Marni had still been alive when they found her, just like Chrisilee had still been alive when he meant for her not to be, Rivera, too, was still alive. Officers rendered aid and called EMS. He was taken to the hospital. In one of those strange turns reality produces without caring how unbelievable they sound, it was the same hospital where Chrisilee Barton was still recovering. Rivera was kept under guard until he was stable enough to be questioned. And when that time came, he did something that must have stunned even the detectives who had spent weeks chasing him. He opened up. He immediately admitted that he had attacked Chrisilee Barton, and he gave details that matched her account exactly. Investigators asked him why he had left and then come back. He explained it was because Marni lived too long. With that, they understood that he was talking about Sergeant Marni Glista. He was telling them that what had happened to Chrisilee had been shaped by what happened to Marni, that he had learned from one attack and applied it to the next. Rivera then confessed to raping and murdering Marni Glista. He confessed to raping and murdering Tiffany Wilson. He said he raped and killed Tiffany inside his van while baby Caitlin was also in the vehicle. And only afterward did he leave Caitlin at the Georgia Welcome Center. He also confessed to raping and murdering Melissa Dingess and Tabitha Bosdell. He said he was willing to take the police to where he had dumped their bodies. And as if all of this were not enough, he claimed he had raped more than 200 women and murdered 5 people. But when investigators tried to pin down the supposed 5th murder victim, he could not identify her or provide any useful detail. For the families of Melissa, Tiffany, Tabitha, and Marni, those confessions meant the end of one kind of torment and the start of another. The mystery was no longer who had done it. The mystery was how one man had been able to move through so many lives for so long without being stopped. It also meant that the earlier encounters, the ones with women like Jen Durbin and Kathy Kranz, had walked away from, took on a whole new weight. Those were not isolated pervert calls. They were surviving glimpses of a serial predator testing his methods in public. They were warnings no one yet knew how to read, and the man at the center of it all had not looked like a monster in the ways people expect monsters to look. He had looked like a father, a church-going husband, a former serviceman, a working man with children and neighbors who knew his name. That is the part of what made this case so unnerving then, and what keeps it unnerving now. Rivera wasn't some antisocial recluse. He was a family man and active in his community. Rivera eventually went on trial in January of 2004. That trial focused on the murder of Sergeant Marni Glista and the attempted murder and rape of Chrisilee Barton. Even then, years after his arrest, he continued to shock people around him. During the proceedings, Rivera begged for the death penalty. He insisted that he could not control himself, that the urge to rape and kill were something inside of him that he couldn't stop. He said that if he were ever free again, he would do it again. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Deliberations took 9 hours. In the end, Rivera was convicted on all counts and sentenced to death. Because he received the death penalty, authorities did not move forward with the other cases in court. In practical terms, the sentence resolved the system's need to incapacitate him, even if it left some of those families without the full courtroom reckoning that might have come from trying to reach each crime separately. He remains on death row at Georgia Diagnostic and Classification State Prison in Jackson, Georgia. And even there, he kept trying to force the outcome he wanted. When his attorneys attempted to present evidence that might reduce his sentence from death to life, Rivera tried to fire them. He wanted to be put to death, but sentences, convictions, and prison walls do not restore what he took. They don't give Tiffany Wilson's husband, Josh, back the life he should have had with her, or erase the cruelty of how long investigators wasted treating him like the killer instead of the man desperate to find his wife. Later, when he participated in a documentary, the depth of that love came through clearly. They do not give Caitlin Wilson the mother she lost when she was too young to hold on to even a single memory of her. She grew up looking like Tiffany and wishing she had anything concrete to carry with her. The sound of her mother's voice, her smell, the feel of being around her, something ordinary and intimate, the kind of thing most people inherit without ever having to think about it. Rivera took that from her before she was old enough to know what it was that was being stolen. The same is true for the families of Melissa Dingess, Tabitha Bosdell, and Marni Glista, whose futures were rerouted by a man that they did not know was passing through their lives until it was too late. And then there is Rivera's own family, his wife and children, people who apparently had no idea what he had been hiding beneath the public version of himself. He didn't just destroy strangers' lives, he detonated his own home too. So when you think about this case, when I think about this case, I think one of the biggest questions is whether any of this could have looked different if those early encounters had been taken a little bit more seriously. If the so-called pervert calls had been treated like warning signs instead of just another gross guy making women uneasy. If investigators had stopped looking so hard at the easiest targets and started looking sooner at the pattern right in front of them. That is the real conversation here. Not just who Reinaldo Rivera was, because we know that now. A dirty, skeezy man who really should have been locked up a long time ago. But how many chances did he get before anyone truly saw him for what he was? And once you know how many women crossed paths with him and survived by sheer instinct or luck, it becomes impossible not to wonder how many others never got the chance to tell anyone what happened. This has been Joshua John with Behind the Headlines, and until next time, stay safe.